afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you all here today. My name is Carol Vincent. I'm a Professor of Sociology of Education from UCL Institute of Education. And I'm delighted to be here to introduce Dr Humera Iqbal, who's going to talk for this lunchtime lecture today. Humera is a psychology lecturer at the Thomas Coram Institute of the Institute of Education. And she's a great friend of mine and a great colleague, so I'm really pleased to be able to welcome her here today. I first met Humera when she was working with me on a project that we did looking at adults and children's friendships across social class and ethnic difference. And Humera's great strength is that she crosses the boundaries between psychology and sociology, and that brings a really great source of expertise to any project. She's currently working on a project that links museums with mental health, so that's a very interesting new project. But she's here to talk to you today about a project that she's very recently finished working on that is about young people as language brokers. She's going to talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. So can we please welcome Humera Iqbal? Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. खुशामदीद, बहुत शुक्रिया आपको सबको आने के लिए। आज मैं आपको एक ख़ास चीज़ के बारे में बात करना चाहती हूँ, और ये है बच्चे जो तर्जुमा करते हैं अपने माँ बाप के लिए। How many of you understood that? Yay! Well, for those of you that didn't, how did it make you feel? Basically I just introduced myself and I said my name's Dr Humera Iqbal, and I told you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. Many of us have been in a situation where we don't understand the language that's been spoken around us. This can be when we're on holiday, for example, or in the great streets of this amazing city. You can easily lose that sense of not grasping the main points of a conversation, or not understanding what's been said, and sort of not being in control. Now, picture a situation where you're a young person that's migrated to a new country with your family. Let's say that country is England. None of you speak English, but you manage to get enrolled into school. You quickly pick up some of the main words and soon are able to communicate, before your parents, in fact. Inevitably, you began to translate and interpret for your families. Academics like myself would call you a child language broker, a young interpreter, or even a paraphraser. In today's lunchtime lecture, I'm going to be drawing from my work, which I did with Dr Sarah Crafter, who's based at the Open University, and telling you some of what we found. But I'm mainly going to be focusing on the topic of what a young interpreter or a child language broker is, and talking through some of the key points. So we'll look at who they are, some of the key themes relating to language brokering, and I'll then play a film based on our research. So, if we want to define who and what child language brokers are, how do we go about doing this? Well, child language brokers are the children of immigrants. They're young people who migrate with their families to a new country and rapidly learn the host society language before their parents. Inevitably, they become translators and interpreters for family members, friends, and members of the community. They make an invaluable contribution to family life, to local communities and institutions, and in a sense, they help facilitate integration. They can be as young as 7 years of age, young people can continue translating up until the age of 18, and some people continue to translate into adulthood as well. Coming back to the title of the lecture, and also the word child language broker, why do we use the term brokers? Well, essentially, child language brokers act as intermediaries between two parties, between their family member or parents who they're translating for, and, for example, teachers, between their parents and bankers, between their parents and lawyers. So they act as intermediaries, a sort of filter through which communication takes place. In a sense, they mediate two different cultural systems. And they're not by no means passive. They can influence the nature and content of the message that they're translating. And in the same way that a financial or mortgage broker is supposed to work on behalf of a client, so too do language brokers. They work on behalf of their parents or the person they're translating for. So they're by no means passive actors. They're no means simply translating. They do far more than this. Child language brokers translate in a range of spaces, and these spaces are often adult spaces. They include healthcare, schools, shops, police stations, banking, banks or immigration offices, with landlords, welfare offices, and so on. They do this for adult relatives, for family members, for friends, fellow students at school, for neighbours, and for strangers as well, sometimes on the street. And I just ask you to think about the first time that you opened a bank account. And then, there's so much that is involved in kind of setting up a bank account. You have to have all the documents, understand the different systems, speak to a range of different people. Now imagine you're a young person who doesn't have, who's just learned to speak English, and you're translating on behalf of your parents and trying to set up a bank account. It's quite a complex process. But that's enough for me for the moment. Why don't we hear the voices of the young people themselves? And I'm going to play to you now a short animation which comes from some of the findings of the research I've been doing.
Came to England, it was really cloudy, the sky was grey, and I felt like somebody turned off the light. At first, when I couldn't speak the language, so someone had to interpret for me, I felt like a weight. My first day of school, I was alone, so I didn't have an interpreter. I had to find classes myself.
I started translating when I was 9 or 10, because that's when I fully started understanding English.
I translate almost every day, not just for my parents, but also for my family.
When you're with your family, you can try and translate, and if you get something wrong, then they will understand.
But if you have to translate for someone who you don't really know, it's a bit difficult.
We speak our language to our parents, and we speak another one to other people, and it's like a double life.
I do it in different places. There's always somewhere that you might need to translate.
The doctors, something were really patient, but something found me really weird when I was in there. Why are you in here? And I want a private conversation with your nan. And I felt like sometimes upset because I'm helping someone.
When I translate, I feel kind of scared because I'm scared that I might get something wrong and I don't understand some of the questions.
It's just something that makes you different from everyone else.
Yeah, I think it makes you more mature, I would say.
Yeah, when you interpret someone, you feel kind of happy that you're helping someone else.
When I'm translating, like for my parents or for my friends, after that moment, I'm feeling very proud of myself.
I do feel proud to translate for my family because that means I'm progressing on learning how to speak English.
I felt how the other person I was interpreting for, I felt how they were feeling because I was in that position once.
I'm really proud of where I come from, and I'm really proud of my language.
Okay, so that was the voices of the young people. And I think it was important to show that because some of the key themes I'm going to talk about now were touched upon in that animation. And I think when thinking about child language brokering, there are many cross-cutting and important areas to think about. These include migration in the life course, young people in an adult world, the state and resources, and policy guidance. And I'm going to look at each of these in turn and think about how they relate to language brokering. Okay, so the first one is migration in the life course. Well, historically, Britain has experienced migration, has always experienced migration from the Vikings to the Normans and so on. But it was really only after the 1950s that migration began to increase rapidly. And more interesting, there was a sort of diversity in the range of incomers. So people were coming from a lot of different places. However, despite this rapid change or the super diversity, the institutions and systems around which Britain was built continue to be dominated by monolingual ideologies. And migrant families and their children have to navigate these systems and try and make sense of them where predominantly everything is in English. What we're talking about today is set in the UK, so I'm talking about it from a British context, but it is by no means unique to Britain. This is happening in countries across the world, from the USA to Italy to Russia to Germany, Sweden and Italy. So young people are translating in this way across the world. And thinking about some statistics then in a British context on migration, the UK's foreign-born population in 2016 was estimated to be over 8.9 million. So that is around 14% of the total population of 65 million. Out of this foreign-born population, about 9% are children, aged 0 to 15, and about 10% are youth, 15 to 25. So these are substantial numbers we're talking about. Another way to look at data and to find out about children who might be translating is to look at data on migrant children receiving support for English as an additional language. This is when English is not the first language spoken at home. EAL status is self-reported and is used in schools in England only. It is estimated that in 2015, 19% of primary school students and 15% of secondary school students were EAL. That's a figure that's doubled since 1997. So, the main point is that a lot of people have come and English might not be the first language for everyone. Now, when you think of migration, the actual physical act of migration in a sense is a journey. But it's not just a physical journey. In a sense, it's a personal journey as well. And migration is very much intertwined with the idea of life course. It influences identity, belonging, memories, who we love and who we left behind. And this is certainly true for adults. We often hear accounts of their journeys of migration, but less so for children and young people. And it's important to hear from them as well. This is Marina's story, and Marina was a young person who we worked with in the project, and she traced out her life course or her journey. You can see she was born in Spain, and at a young age migrated to Peru to live with her grandmother without her parents. Then again, she moved back to Spain. At that point, she thought it was to live for the rest of her life there. But then, in 2013, again migrated to London. So you can see, by this point, she's already made a number of migration journeys. And then we see that in 2015, she begins to start interpreting for her family, for her mum. And interspersed between this, she talks about relationships, she talks about important life events. So you can see that all of these aspects show that migration is very much a journey, a personal journey, and it's intertwined with many important life events. And just looking at a sample of languages spoken at one of the schools that I worked in, you can see the sheer range of diversity of languages, and this is just in one school, all the languages spoken. This is a school based in London. And it ties into the idea of life course because, there's also the idea of transnational journeys. And I'd like you to look at the Italian Bengali one. This is actually Elora, who speaks, Elora, one of our participants, one of the people we worked with. And she was a young girl who was born in Bangladesh, so she spoke Bengali with her parents. And then she migrated at quite a young age to Italy, where she picked up Italian and began to translate for her parents, so Italian to Bengali. Between her siblings and herself, they spoke in Italian, so siblings spoke in Italian, Bengali to mum and dad. Then they migrated to England, in London actually, and in London, again, she had to pick up English and ended up translating for her parents English to Bengali. But the way it worked was English to Bengali to her parents. Her siblings were still learning English, and she kind of gained skills in it more. So she was translating English to Italian to her siblings. And in the house, it was Bengali to her parents and Italian to her siblings. So you can see the complexity that can take place in a young person's life and in a family's life when they move between countries and pick up different languages. this point, you might be wondering, why have I put up a picture of a Parker pen? Well, I will just enlighten you. What does it have to do with anything? Well, essentially, it's a metaphor to kind of show that translating can be complex. Not all words can be translated, and sometimes two words sound very similar. Do you speak Spanish at the back? Okay, don't know. Someone's smiling, so they might get the joke. Yep, you do. Okay, so let me explain this. When Parker Pen entered the Mexican market, the logo and the main logo was, "It won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you." However, it was translated in the following way in Spanish. I won't attempt to say it in Spanish because my Spanish is not great. But what this actually was translated to was, "It won't leak in your pocket and impregnate you." The reason for this is the word embarazada means pregnant in Spanish. But whoever Parker Pen employed didn't do a very good job, because embarazada certainly does not mean embarrassed. This is just to show you that adults can get it wrong. Big companies like Parker can get it wrong too. And translating is a complex phenomenon. Some words can sound the same. For a young person, embarrassed and embarazada who teenagers are often embarrassed, hopefully not often embarazada, it can be a particular issue. And I think that serves as a segue, this idea of complexity, into our next key theme. And that is the one about young people living in an adult world. So this, in a sense, is also divided into a number of themes around ethics, children's well-being, power dynamics, and also agency. Now, as I said, young people often translate for two adults, and they can also often translate in adult spaces. And a number of issues come up around this, and some of these can be quite controversial. There's a well-founded, in terms of ethics, there's a well-founded professional resistance to the use of children as interpreters in challenging or sensitive situations. Like other non-professional or professional interpreters, they are likely to make, or they possibly make mistakes in translations, and can also change the meanings of words or can withhold information. This can occur for many different reasons. Firstly, because technical words can be misunderstood, or the two words don't have equivalent terms. So, mistakes can be made. And also there are ethical concerns about placing a child in a situation that can involve sensitive topics, for instance at the doctors, or in a dangerous environment, for example in a police station, should young people be translating. And that links to the idea of well-being, because requiring children and young people to engage with adult affairs like finance and health can lead to possibly stress for the young person. It can be stressful for them. And bear in mind that the young people and families have just migrated to a new place, so that also brings with it a lot of stress. But then to kind of become a translator as well can bring with it more stress. So this idea of well-being comes about. Then there's the idea of power dynamics and parent in relation to adults and parents. Some people argue that children, in a sense, are being parentified. So they're doing adult roles or parents' roles. I mean, how many of you in here are parents? How would you feel about your child acting this role? Would you trust them to do this for you? Would you trust them to translate? Do you think that they would translate everything correctly? So these are just some things to think about. And taking all of this into consideration, some people argue that children should never be used as translators or child language brokers. And this is from a child welfare perspective and also from a professional interpreter perspective. But one thing to say is, much of the thinking and the research on childhood has been dominated by sort of Western cultural assumptions about the nature of childhood. And this has dominated thinking since the late 19th century. And this is the idea that children or young people should be free from adult concerns, they should spend their time in schooling, they should spend their time playing, and they'll be adults eventually and they'll take on those responsibilities. However, this is, as I said, is quite a Western cultural assumption, or a Western way of thinking in a sense, because in other cultures, the notion of childhood can be quite different. And it can mean taking more responsibility as one grows older, and it can mean taking more responsibility in relation to others and acting in a more interdependent way, and being more autonomous as well. So in a sense, child language brokers seem to act in this way. They're taking on responsibilities as a young people and acting in a sort of more interdependent way. And I think that what's quite interesting is that from a theoretical perspective, research from the sociology of childhood also challenges us to kind of not consider young people and children to be passive actors, but actually think of them as being agentic and having active voices. And in a sense, the young people in this who are acting in this role are kind of fulfilling those criteria in a sense. So, right, even though, there's all of these concerns, and even though the data tells us that, there are many people who don't speak English as their first language and who would require translators and interpreters, basically, there's just not enough translators and interpreters to go around. There's not enough to meet the needs required. And this is for a number of reasons. One, because of professional cuts by kind of local councils and the governments. There's just not enough funding. Second of all, there's such a range and diversity of languages. There's many rare languages. So to be able to meet the needs of all of these rare languages is quite difficult. And, for example, from Igbo to Twa to Pashto, to get people to speak all of these languages is quite hard. And families who have just migrated to a new setting, they often, in a sense, place more trust in their children or family member to translate for them. They also kind of feel that the confidentiality will be retained by having a family member or their child translate. And they feel, in a sense, that they would have more control over the situation. So they often would prefer to use young people and children to translate for them, their child. So no matter, taking everything together, no matter what you might think about it, whether you consider it to be unethical, whether you think that, childhood should be looked at in a different way, child language brokering does take place. It is going on. And rather, I think, in my opinion, rather than ignore it and pretend it doesn't happen, it's important to address it, to learn more about it, and to understand what we can do to help improve the situation or if we can make changes. And this is a picture that Hristo made. Hristo was a young boy from Bulgaria who we worked with, and it's a wee comic. And he talks about going into his sister's school. And you can see at the top, teacher says there's loads of forms to fill in. Are you ready to register? And his parents are looking quite confused. And Hristo says, don't worry, I'll interpret for you. And so he helps them out in this particular situation. And I think just the point to make before I move on to the next point is that, what we need to think about is when it's okay for young people to translate, and in which situations they should absolutely not be translating. And that's kind of something to bear in mind. Okay, the third point is around the state and resources. You might ask, what on earth does Patsy from Absolutely Fabulous have to do with anything in regard to this? Well, this is just to give you an example of one case study or one place where child language brokers work a lot. So this is a picture of Joanna Lumley with the Gurkhas in Aldershot in Hampshire in England. The Gurkhas, of course, have fought with the British Army since 1815 and are of Nepalese descent, so from Nepal. In 2009, Joanna Lumley led the Gurkha Justice Campaign. With popular support, she forced the government to abandon rules preventing Gurkha soldiers who had retired before 1997 from settling in the UK. What happened then was that it led to a huge surge in numbers of former Gurkha soldiers coming to the UK to settle. And they sort of decided to settle in Aldershot. Why did they choose Aldershot? Well, it's a military town, and it's close to the old Gurkha barracks, and with an existing network of welfare centres. And the law said that also, the change in the law allowed for dependents, so children under the age of 18 to arrive with their families as well. So there was a huge surge in numbers of Nepalese kind of former Gurkha families coming to Aldershot. And this, in a sense, caused challenges, it created challenges for Aldershot and structures and institutions there, and particularly schools. And I actually visited one of the schools in 2016, and this is just an extract from my field notes. So JNR, who work in the school, they spoke to us about the recent, in the past 5 years, arrival of Nepalis to the neighbourhood and the school. They said 1 year, as many as 16 new Nepali-speaking pupils came to one class. This placed pressure in the school because they didn't have the facilities to kind of deal with this. There was no interpreter to work with, professional, with the children and the teachers. And then the backdrop of this was that in kind of wider Aldershot, in the wider Basingstoke and Hampshire area, there was tensions in the neighbourhood. There was a sort of xenophobic environment, and again, kind of thinking about current political climate, this isn't just limited to Aldershot or Basingstoke. Across the UK, we see increasingly kind of xenophobic tensions, Brexit, Islamophobia, etc. And so this was 5 years on, and at this stage, young people were translating a lot. Young people who had arrived had picked up English, and so the teachers told us how they were kind of playing a big role in this particular area. What's particularly interesting in the case of Aldershot is that they had some help from the local council. They were able to access resources set up by Hampshire Council. Now let me tell you, this is one of the only, in fact it's the only scheme available across the UK, and it's been fairly successful. Basically, the kind of MTAS, or in Hampshire Council, they've set up a resource, an online resource, with kind of guidance for teachers, for schools. They also pay visits to teachers in schools and help kind of figure out what to do when you have a lot of new incomers. And they've set up this Young Interpreter scheme, which is a training scheme which encourages teachers to set up clubs and allows for peer-to-peer mentoring. So young people who are already in school kind of welcome new pupils or new arrivals and help them settle in and help them with their English. So it's been successful in a sense. Ofsted, which is the kind of education regulation board, they said that it's another excellent example of practice that supports and develops children and young people's confidence and leadership skills in schools. So in this particular context of Aldershot, there was some help available, but there are a lot of young child interpreters working in this because there's still not enough professional help. So that was kind of the state and resources. And I'm now going to move on to the last point, which is around policy guidance. Okay, so, well, we've talked about Hampshire and the fact that it exists, okay, but one thing to note about Hampshire and this particular body that runs the Young Interpreter Scheme is that they're constantly under threat of being closed and shut down. They're constantly worried about funding cuts, just shutting them down essentially. And it's important, they really worry about being able to sustain themselves. On a national, well, there has been some guidance which has been developed by Professor Tony Klein, who's based at UCL, and Dr. Sarah Crafter at the Open University. And they developed a report with the Nuffield Foundation for schools around guidance and practice for child language brokering in school. However, on the national level, there is no guidance available for professionals, for doctors, for lawyers, for councils, etc., on what to do when a young person comes in translating for their family, how they can facilitate the communication, when they should say, no, this is not appropriate for a young person to be translating, and how to work with families. There's no guidance available. And so there's a lot to do in this regard. And as I said, my colleague Sarah Crafter and I had been working on this project to understand about child language brokers and kind of learn more about them. And one thing we did as part of this project was that we developed a short film for professionals, which I'm going to show you now. This film is by no means national policy guidance or anything, but it's just a tool that we hope will be able to help professionals a little bit. So I'll play it to you now.
I help my mum with the translating every day and translate letters and doctor's appointments, calls, everything.
Mostly it will be school-related stuff, shops sometimes, or like if she needs a cab or something, or she needs to call someone.
Without me, they would have been struggling because they wouldn't know what they're being told.
Young translators and interpreters are young people who linguistically mediate between two languages on behalf of their family and officials and other professional services. Although children translating and interpreting for family members is a very common practice, it's often something we don't talk about very much.
There is, in fact, at national level, but also at local level, virtually no detailed guidance on this major and increasing challenge.
Immigration is portrayed in the media in such a negative light that you see it in the kids, how the kids behave when they come to school, how shy they are, how the lack of confidence in general.
Now, it's a huge demand for translators for rare languages, for example. Of course, they are not professional translators, but they can help a lot.
Some of them are really embarrassed that they don't speak English or can't write in English, so I just tell them, look, I don't write in Bulgarian or Italian or Portuguese, so we're both beginners, it's okay.
Children are very competent, it's often just not seen or recognized. And yet if we look at, for example, children who are doing translation for families, we can see an incredible level of competence and capability.
I know it's quite demanding, but in the same time, I find that they feel proud about that, and they feel like they can contribute and they want to do it.
The issue of how you manage communication between professional and client is a big deal.
From speaking to young people and professionals, there are some strategies that you can put in place to help the situation.
They could try and be more patient with us and just try their best to make the speech simpler.
Think of the child's feelings and try and be alert to the dynamics of the interaction and the translating situation.
I can't translate like every single word in just 1 second because I need time to think about the words.
Children can sometimes feel intimidated by the situations, so it's worth being aware that it's a child speaking between two adults, and particularly one of the adults is someone of authority.
They speak so quickly that I can't understand and I can't translate it.
Whilst there are some contentious situations where children should absolutely not be asked to be young translators, there are everyday situations where children are happy to translate. They just see it as part of a normal part of their everyday lives.
Just be friendly and work with the staff so that the staff are very friendly and understanding about the different needs of the kids. And so that sort of creates an environment where they're not being judged.
It's always good to ask them because they know best and they can tell you if they want or they don't want to do it.
In difficult economic times, there's no way that public services that offer interpreting support are going to expand. It will be from the communities themselves, from families themselves, that any resource will be made available.
When I'm translating, like for my parents or for my friends, after that moment, I'm feeling very proud of myself.
I do feel proud to translate for my family because that means I'm progressing on learning how to speak English.
I felt how the other person I was interpreting for, I felt how they were feeling, because I was in that position once.
I'm really proud of where I come from, and I'm really proud of my language.
I like the music at the end. So that's a little film that we made, and I guess that kind of covers a lot of what I said today, really, but encourages us to think about how we communicate. We could do this in our everyday life, speaking slowly, kind of using gestures, etc. And I hope after today, really, this is a picture of us with, we did some exhibitions at UCL in the Art Museum and as part of Bloomsbury Festival. This is one of our young translators and her nan, who she translates for. So I hope after today you get a sense of how special these young people are and how, you know, there's a way to go about raising awareness about this topic, how we need some more guidelines, and, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done. And coming back to the title of the talk, they may not be stockbrokers, but they certainly have all of the tenacity needed to trade on that market floor. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Humera. That was really, really good, very interesting. We have a few minutes for questions. There is a roving microphone even. So if you would like to ask a question, if you just stick up your hand and we will bring the microphone to you. It would be great if people keep their questions fairly concise so we can fit some in. Yes, there's a lady here. Thank you.
What work is being done, assuming we come out of Europe, to deal with the situation after Brexit, when presumably there will be less need for some languages because people will not be coming? Will that be automatically seen as a reason for cutting funding even further?
Gosh, Brexit, that old little one. That's kind of a political question. I don't necessarily know what the government's going to do in terms of funding cuts. I mean, you know, we've seen the Brexit bill, or Lord knows what's going to happen. But in terms of languages spoken, I mean, yeah, I don't really know how to answer that. I think that there's still going to be international migration. It might just be that there's going to be more people coming from other parts of the world and less coming from Europe. Britain's got, you know, kind of economically, it's a big incentive, and also kind of the labour market is an incentive for people to migrate here, and the fact that English is a language that's quite universal. So even if people might not be fluent in English, you know, they might kind of be able to understand key words. So I do still think that young people are still going to be translating. I don't know what necessarily is going to happen in terms of professional and community interpreters and whether funding is going to be cut. So it might mean actually that young people, if it is cut, are going to be ever more translating for their families.
Thank you. We got any more questions? Yes, the lady in pink and then a lady down here with the purple scarf.
Hi, thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. I'm really interested in kind of in terms of the policy development impact, because the video that you've produced is absolutely extremely impactful. And I was just wondering about the dissemination of it, and coming from a law background, whether there are agencies like the Law Society, and you mentioned about medical practitioners, is the video being disseminated to certain societies to get it out there? Because I'm sure it will be of great use and significance to those professions.
Thank you. Well, the video is hot off the press. It actually just came to me yesterday, and it's kind of, we still have a few more tweaks to do in terms of editing, but it actually just came from the film editor yesterday. So absolutely, we're going to disseminate it to as wide as an audience as possible. Most certainly, hospitals, doctors, and also from a legal point of view, because the research tells us that in GP practices, for example, child language brokering happens a lot. Also in hospitals, and particularly out of hours when GPs are not open, in emergency situations, young people often go with their families to hospitals and sort of translate. And I think it's really important to kind of get this message out so that kind of professionals know when to say no. We need to hold off and get someone professional, or when they can work with the child or the young person, and if so, kind of tips for helping to improve the communication. So, but absolutely, we'll be reaching out to a lot of people. Might just send it your way too, because you're in the law professional, to kind of send out to your networks.
Thank you. Lady here.
Thank you for an excellent talk. It was really clear and really interesting. My question sort of follows on. I mean, I have hundreds of questions, but the question that follows on is, you talked about professionals saying, no, we need to get somebody in. And I wondered in that the one project in Aldershot, whether that project included enabling children to say no, and whether that project also dealt with talked about language translation, but you also mentioned about cultural translation and whether the project was able to deal with any of those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. In Aldershot, the Young Interpreters Scheme, so it was kind of led by the council, and they are actually very much about encouraging children to say no. In fact, they don't encourage children to necessarily translate in doctors' offices at all. They're more about welcoming newcomers into a school, maybe kind of under adult supervision, translating parents-teacher evenings, etc. And a lot of the kind of the Young Interpreter Scheme. So it's a whole kind of course, a series of workshops that the young people do over a number of weeks, and then they have regular meetings. But it does very much kind of put the child first and talk about, when it is correct to translate, when it's not, and when you should say no. So in that case, yes. And the other part of your question was around cultural mediation. And I think the interesting thing about this is that the young person who's just migrated with their family, they have to understand sort of the cultural systems from the country that they came from. So if they came from Bangladesh, how do you set up a bank account in Bangladesh? And then you have to learn how do you set up a bank account. I don't know why I keep using the example of banks, but maybe because I struggle with them. But how do you set up a bank account in Britain? So in a sense, they have to understand two different cultural systems. And it's not just in the context of banks, it's cultural norms, etiquette, British sense of humour or British reservedness. Kind of sometimes when we say yes, we mean no in Britain. I speak to my friends who are from all over the world, and they're like, I don't get, and so imagine being a young person in that setting trying to negotiate that. So really understanding all these cues as well. And so for our AHRC project, we were really interested in exploring those. And we were also interested in exploring what happens when there's a situation of conflict. So when tensions flare, or when it's a kind of very, what does the young person do? How do they control the situation? They're translating on behalf of their parents. So say, for example, their parents are saying, swear at the professional, tell them so the children have different strategies for managing this. Some of them are just translate directly, but some of them take more active strategies, and they selectively modify or change the conversation to make it more correct to the particular setting. So in that sense, they're really understanding how to behave in a particular setting. So absolutely, cultural mediation is really, really a key part of it. They are mediators in a sense, yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one last quick question. Yes, the lady here. Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. And actually, I have some students, they just moved here, and they are really struggle with their language because they can't speak English. So one is from year 5. She is a French, and another one is year 7, and she is Chinese. Mm-hmm. And I find that at the beginning, the thing is really difficult. I want to ask how long it normally takes the students to settled in the school, and they can know the culture and know the language. How long it normally takes for them to become the translator?
That really varies according to the school. For example, in schools where you have this, you have EAL coordinators in school. Each EAL coordinator is quite unique and quite different. Some schools give EAL coordinators more autonomy to be able to manage programs. In those cases, they already have a system in place to help the young person settle in. But it varies from school to school. And then, there's the political dimension. In one of the schools we were working with, some of the young people had come from Afghanistan, and there was a lot of racial tension towards them. They were not fitting in because of other kind of dynamics as well. So there's many layers to that question. I don't think there's one answer. I think for each particular young person, it varies. And also it varies on the amount of support they're getting as well. So I'm sorry I don't have a succinct answer, but...
Thank you very much. We need to stop there, but thank you all for coming, and thank you to Humera for talking.